doesn't do anything with it. Other times it gets a little bit more complicated. But eventually, I think the goal of, yes, so we have a question in the back.
When you talk about using it multiple shapes, are you talking about like one component and then what different instances of that component?
No, this would be.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Yeah, that was a great question. So the question was, when we talk about multiple components of the same component, is it an instantiation of that component as like an object, or is it a copy and paste where you're saying, I'm going to use this component in multiple places. So essentially, the same code is going to be in your code base multiple places. Was that essentially? So yeah. So it's not when we say that they are multiple of the same components. It really should be, yes, it's the same. You're essentially, and we can look at a code example later, but the way you put a component into your HTML is essentially just like you render it as like an HTML tag. So you would have that HTML tag in 5 different spots, but that code would live in that component itself. So it wouldn't be 5 different files all doing the same thing. It would be one file. Yes, you would be rendering it in different parts of the application, but the component would hold its own functionality. Any other questions? And we can look at code examples later. And we have a few. I know this is kind of abstract. So one of the things that I like about Vue.js that I haven't seen in other frameworks, and especially in the JavaScript community, not including TypeScript, but you can actually require props, and you can say in your prop, so in your child component, you can say, hey, parent, when I render myself, I expect to have this data. So I expect to have this name, the first name value. Like when I render, I need the first name value. And I need, that's required. So every time I come onto the screen, or I come into existence, I'm going to need that value. Anytime I'm rendered, I require that value to be functional. And you can even, for readability, you can say that the first name, it's a string. So any developer that comes in that's looking at that code can look at it and say, okay, I know for sure when this prop comes in, I'm dealing with a string. And I personally like that, but I kind of lean more towards strongly typed languages. It's easier to debug, more or less. If you know what data you're getting and you know that it's required, and it tells you that it's easier to debug. So what if I pass the name value a number? I want to know about that. And likewise, we need smart parents. So for a myriad of reasons, not just in Vue.js, but so parents should hold all the state. So a parent can render 20 different components, and even those components, those children components could render 20 more. And it's kind of this endless chain. But eventually, it needs to all roll back up to the parent. You don't necessarily have to do it this way. This is just one pattern, if you will, that we developed that we think works for us. And we can talk about some of the pros and cons of that later in the talk. But essentially, parents should hold all the state. So you can imagine the clearest example of if you have a form that requires a certain amount of information in order for it to be submitted to the server. Well, you can imagine that if your first name, last name, middle name are all holding that state of their value, how does the parent know that it should enable the buttons? It would kind of be a nightmare. It would be disorganized, to say the least, and difficult. So we kind of have this, again, we go back to the notion of we're emitting events up and we're sending data down. and a parent should subscribe to the events that it cares about. So what if a child is omitting this event that it's meant for another child, or the parent doesn't necessarily care about this component or this action. So I like to think of it as subscribe. So Vue uses emissions, and I like to think of them as you're just subscribing to events. Like nothing is going to happen if you don't subscribe to it. But if you want that information, you need to subscribe to it. And that's what I like. So what does the parent care about? And this is an application by application basis. Maybe it doesn't need to know about anything. I guess it depends on what your application needs are. But kind of the flexibility is that the parent can know things and it can't know things. It's kind of up to you to make that design decision. It doesn't force you into any one way. Kind of going off on a tangent, one of the statements against Vue.js is that it's too flexible. It lets you do too much. And it can, if you don't, unlike Angular, although this is only from hearsays, Angular has very, very strict rules against what you can and cannot do. And some people really like that. So if you have a giant application, it would be really useful if there's only one or two ways that you can do one thing. And that makes sense. But if you're a little bit smaller and you're trying to figure things out or you're experimenting, Vue.js gives you the flexibility to do things that you may not be able to do in other frameworks. The caveat to that being it will let you do things that might come back and be a headache for you later at a later point in time. As your application starts to scale, it's like, well, we're doing this action literally 5 different ways. And I can point to code in our code base where we're doing just that, where because there's not a standard, if you will, you kind of just do what works. And some solutions are better than others, but Vue.js will let you run with your solution if it meets some bare minimum requirement of not throwing a console error. Are there any questions about that? Does anybody have a lot of experience with another framework like Angular or React? Yeah? Have you Angular?
Both.
Well, so Angular, is it right that Angular is very strict about the way you handle certain events and is that correct?
Yeah, it is one that you have to come up with a completely different way of doing some of the things, and with Angular one that way you would think you could do it, should be built in both components or the feature.
Yeah. So going into the benefit of the smart parent, you can control what the user is able to do. So for example, if a user is filling out a form and you're transitioning to different pages, or you have a modal and it's going to different views, you want to make sure that in order for me to go to page 1 to page 2, I need this minimum amount of information. Having the parent control that makes for easier development. You protect your server from incomplete data. So you can, upfront, if you're submitting a form and it needs to have this information and you click enter, you don't want to send that to the server and then the server looks at it and says, hey, I need the last name of this form in order for me to create this model or this row in the database. I'm going to spit it back down to you until I get this information. You can really handle that right there on the parent, on the client side. It's easy, and the way we set up our application, if the parent is kind of handling all of this data and it knows what it does and doesn't have, it makes that a pretty painless exercise. Spoke just briefly about this earlier. We want to avoid child-to-child communication. And in order to have that never be an issue, we just make sure that our parent holds all the information that any child component would need. There'd never be an instance where you'd have, even if, so for a while we had, in our application, we had kind of this form the user would fill out, and then as they were going, they had this like read-only view that would say, as you type your name, it would show up on the name column. As you put in this information, it would show up. So you're kind of like, instead of just like going through this long form, kind of wondering what's going on, we're just giving you like the view saying, this is the information that we have. Once certain criteria are met, the buttons are enabled, you can go to the next page, so on and so forth. But even, so those were all children of the parent, but none of them really needed to communicate with one another because all the real data that we needed, the parent had in it. It controlled, so the child could require that data as props, it could send it, relay it back down to other children if they require that information, and then events back up to the parent. So that goes along with the next point, is the children have access to the state if it's needed. You might be wondering, well, how do I know if my child component needs this data? And it should become pretty evident if you're working through something and you're like, oh, I need, in order, this piece of data depends on the state or whether this data is in existence or not. And so at that point, you would just come in and say, okay, I want to pass this data down to this child. And now that I have this information that's required, then I can do whatever it is my application calls for, and I can mutate the data or do what I need to do and send it back out to the parent. So kind of as you're maybe thinking about using Vue.js, it's important to kind of keep these concepts in mind. The whole idea, I think, of this like front-end framework is you're really composing your front end of these components. So it's easier to have a composition if things are very loosely coupled. They don't have any hard dependencies, or at least minimize the dependencies as much as possible. So you really can just insert an HTML tag that renders a component, and once you do that, that component is on the page. It can do what it needs to do. It goes events. It emits events. It reads data in, and you essentially have this reusable piece of functionality that you can put in any part of your application, and it works pretty well. Of course, this is all in the perfect world where we don't have to worry about necessarily real-world problems. We're running into issues with that now where it's like, well, we would like these components to be smaller, but sometimes the line of when you divide one component into two components and so on and so forth gets kind of hairy. It's never as clean cut as maybe you think it should be. But kind of we subscribe at Outcome Help, anyways, the team I'm on, we like subscribe to this mantra, if you will, of we want our parent to be super smart, we want the children to be very dumb, and obviously there's gray area in that blanket statement. But I would encourage you guys, if you pick up the framework or walking through the code examples, to kind of keep that in mind. Like, why does this child have this data? What does it do with it? Why does it care about it? What if I change this piece of code to do something else? What's going to happen? And maybe, hopefully, if we did the code examples right, the benefits of doing it will start to show themselves. So the potential problems of this approach, which I can speak to all of these first. A lot of times you are going to, as your application starts to get bigger, you're going to run into this issue where you have a parent and it renders this child. Well, this child just so happens to render another child, and so on and so forth. But what if the bottommost child of this hierarchy needs this piece of data that comes all the way from the parent? So you're essentially, if you're doing it the Vue way, which is passing the props down and emitting the events back up, you're essentially having to pass this piece of data through your HTML 5 different times. And then, likewise, when that bottommost child, something happens to it, and it's like, hey, I have this data that has been updated, you're likewise going to have to admit that event back through those 5 children to the parent. It gets really messy. You start running into these issues where you're like, where is this thing being rendered at, and why is it doing this? And this, you're debugging your print statements in the console. I spent far too much time than I'd like to admit, console print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just to see, 1, 2, 4, 3 in the console and be like, okay, now we have issues. So this does get messy, right? And we can talk, that kind of goes back to what we spoke about earlier, is like, will Vue scale with my application? And I would say that Vue will not. If your application grows to sufficient size, it's going to get messy. And we dealt with that firsthand at Outcome Health, and later in the talk we'll discuss the solution to that. Another problem is that your parent is going to get big. If it cares about a lot of data, then it's going to be holding a lot of state, and you're going to have a really big JavaScript file, which, if you set it up right, you can do other things to maybe modularize the object or namespace it into different categories, but your parent's going to get big. Even if it delegates responsibility to another module, there's going to be a lot going on in that. And there's, depending on how many parents you're dealing with, because essentially anything can be a parent. If it spawns another component, well, then that child is now doing both roles. It's a parent and a child. So it's a parent to the things that it's spawning, but it's a child to the thing that spawned it. So kind of going back to our mantra of data down and events up, if you don't follow this, it gets hairy, right? So it's kind of always, where am I being rendered? Who rendered me? What am I doing with this data? Do I care about this data? Am I just passing this data up? Is my only purpose with this piece of data to admit it to my parent? Do I care about it? It gets a little bit complicated and a little bit untenable. So likewise, you're going to get messy HTML. So the way that Vue passes data and emits events is through the HTML tags. So we can look at a code example later, but when you render this parent or child or just a component in general, you kind of, you have your data, and then you also have like an @ symbol, and you say, hey, at this action, I want to call this method. So HTML gets big, and sometimes too big. We dealt with that where currently we're using Ruby on Rails, and we use a HAML template, and the HAML was humongous, and it was basically unreadable. You had no idea where this data is coming from, what's it doing, how is it getting to this spot in the application. It gets messy. Likewise, where's this coming from? With this data, do I care about this data at all, or am I just going to pass this up to my parent? Any questions about that? So I think Alibaba is the author of Vuex, but it was accepted into the Vue community, and It's this concept that React uses the Flux design principle, and that's essentially you're going to have this kind of godparent at the very top, and they call it a store, and that is what is going to hold all your data. Nothing else. Everything that it doesn't matter what renders what. The only thing it knows about is the store. So your parent, you can think of it, your parent no longer matters. It's only the store. And this is actually really nice. We started implementing this the beginning of this year, and it's a lot of fun. It's really pretty easy to work with, and it's getting back to the jobs thing. It uses the same design patterns as React. So I haven't built anything with React, but just kind of looking at it, it's like, oh, these are the same things that we're doing in our Vue app. And it's really nice. So it replaces the parent's holding state. There's no reason for it because everything can subscribe to the store, and the store holds all of the information that it needs. And if you need a piece of data from the store, that comes in. So previously you were passing in a prop to a child component. Well, now that is computer property that comes from the store. So you're basically just subscribing to this piece of data that's in the store in the form of a computer property. So anytime a piece of data in the store changes, you will automatically have that change. So it's another, I guess, a more advanced way of just two-way data binding. The computer property is the store, and vice versa. So in the documentation, using Vuex, so it kind of goes back to another design choice, if you will. You don't want, because everything is now like talking to the store, if you will, you don't necessarily want to have 20 different things all committing to the store at the same time, because that gets really messy. You essentially because for example, if I have two components and they both commit to the store, that gets pretty hard to debug if there's a bug somewhere in that code and you have 20 or even 2 different commits and 2 different components. It's like, well, which one is causing the bug? They're both committing to the store. So, again, it can kind of get a little untenable. And the way that Vuex kind of solved this is that, so instead of emitting events, essentially what a component will do is they'll dispatch to the store. So they'll just call this method and say, hey, store, I have this new information for you. And the store will get that data and it'll say, okay, great. I'm going to take this data and I'm going to commit to myself. So you have this kind of, if you will, like funneling into the store. The store commits to itself. So when you have that bug that pops up and you don't know where it's coming from, you might not know where it's coming from, but what you can do is test every single place where you're dispatching that action, and then in your store, you can then view the results. So it makes the debugging process a lot easier, and I think that it makes the application much more manageable because everything is kind of, again, it's flowing up into kind of what the original, just the kind of vanilla Vue mantra was, is that we want to have these events that funnel up and then the data comes back down. So it's a pretty interesting concept. I think so anyways. And we were doing it another way, and I can speak firsthand of why this last point is important, because we were originally not doing it this way, and of course we had bugs, and then we went to go look for, well, who's committing this event to the store, and it's in 5 different parts of our application. It gets frustrating. So a lot of this is kind of learning from example, or learning from failure. So please, let us fail for you. So when you guys go and build your applications, you can remember somewhere, oh, I don't want to do this. I want to do it this other way because this other developer told me to, because they learned the hard way. I don't have to learn that way. So. Yeah, again, the store is going to get big. There's really no way around it. Vuex has some built-in namespacing capabilities. So, for example, there's one store, and I think it has, I guess now it has 5 different namespaces. So when you admit to that, you have to namespace it appropriately. Likewise, when you require an event, or when you require data, you have to namespace it appropriately. So the question was, how big does the store get? And it gets big. It's just like a parent, but with more responsibility. And you can, namespace it as such. One thing that, kind of going back to why would I want to use Vue instead of React, and I think one reason that I experienced from firsthand is when we started using Vue, we had a pretty simple application, and none of us were quote unquote front end developers. We were all kind of lean more towards the back end. And Vue was very approachable. Like we didn't necessarily have to worry about. I think one of the things that at least I'm intimidated by when we start talking about React is like it's this whole big ecosystem, and I think it's a double-edged sword. React has a very, very vibrant ecosystem, but at the same time, it's a little intimidating if you've never done a JavaScript framework and you spend 3 hours trying to debug these dependencies, and your package.json is blowing up for various reasons. And by the time you even get to where you're developing your application, you're already spent. So it was a benefit to us not having that experience and not really having somebody that's very, very strong on the front end that has a lot of experience. So we could kind of dive in, and it was very simple for us to see, okay, I have this data. Oh wow, I'm like seeing it on the page. It was a nice I guess, surprise, because it was so easy just to like plug in and like begin developing. It has really good documentation, and I really like it, and I hope that maybe you guys will take interest in using it for your application or for your side project. So, do you guys want to look at some code examples, and we can kind of go through and make some of this abstract stuff a little bit less abstract? So this is so in our meetup, the last 2 meetups that we've done for Vue.js, which I encourage all of you to come to those meetups. It's like this. I'll come help. It is nice enough to provide a space. If nothing else, we have free food and booze. So come out and eat and drink for free. And then the only caveat is you might have to listen to me again or someone else. So this is the last 2 Vue.js meetups. We've kind of done these workshops where it's like we're going to build an application. And this is one of the applications that we built. And we built it in 2 different ways. And the way we're looking at it now is, if you can tell, we're just like calling the local file system, the index.html. This doesn't have any npm dependencies, and we can look at the code and kind of compare and contrast. So this one does use npm, and but I think it's easier to start with this. Just to kind of highlight some of the like ease of use, maybe without kind of the noise of what are all these files doing. I did npm install, Vue.js or whatever, and I got 30,000 files, most of which I have no idea what they do, and that becomes more apparent when one of them doesn't work, and you're just kind of dead in the water before you even start. So one of the things with Vue is they have, I think React and I'm sure Angular has it too, is this console where you can kind of see your application. So kind of to demonstrate the parent-child relationship, and think of them, really, I mean, it is a hierarchy. And this demonstrates that nicely. So you can even click into these, and it will kind of tell you what is a prop, what does it do, what is this computed thing, what is this moving object, what is this list. So it's easy to kind of go into the application, especially when you're developing it and you're getting started doing certain things. I really like this tool and encourage you to. Sure. Sorry about that. So this is something, a little toy application. It should be noted, this also uses Vuex, and we can look at the code to do that. But essentially, we just kind of wanted to make a more innocuous version of Tinder, something kind of everybody understands. It's kind of an easy thing to make once you get the hang of the framework, and it demonstrates a lot of kind of core functionality like event handling, computer properties, props, state management, which we can look at. So essentially, I just say what I do and don't like, and of course, that doesn't work because this requires the internet and I don't have it. But that's okay, it just won't render the picture. And this will also be available. This is on GitHub. I'll post the slides when I get down here. And you can fork this repo, bring it down, and play around with it. But essentially, you can like and dislike various things, and it'll move on to the next movie. And then you can kind of look here and say, kind of get this running list of what you have liked and what you have not liked. Looks like there's a little bit of a CSS issue there. So yeah, that's essentially what our application does. Not incredibly complicated, but certainly sufficient for you if you have never used Vue.js, or if you are like me and you've never used a JavaScript framework. So our app is rendered here. Like we said, we essentially we're just importing these libraries, Vue.js and Vuex, and that is, it's in our, if you want to look at the source code, it's right there. And so I render my application here. This is what I was speaking with in regards to rendering your components in an HTML tag. That is how you render a component to the application. So it's just a tag. So let's go into that app, this T-Vendor application, I believe that it is this. So what comprises this? So we have a component, which is this. So that corresponds, so make sure this is open. So we have this thing here. It renders this guy, and we have the name plugged in. We tell Vue that it's a component, and we also tell the component what is the template that it's going to use. And this is one of the differences between using just kind of .js files and .vue files, which requires NPM, is that when you use NPM, you have this option of scoping your CSS. So literally your entire component is in one file, and you give it the HTML, and you even give it has this option of scoped or unscoped CSS properties. So if you pass in your CSS portion of your component file and you say this is scope, that means that all of those CSS classes are just going to be rendered in that component. Nobody else has access to that, which is nice. But we don't have that luxury, so we have the style sheets CSS file. So when you're looking at it, just be aware that that's there. So we have the template that it's using, and then you have weird stuff, again, that looks like this. So what is this? Well, it looks like this app header, it looks like that's another component. So if we go into here, oh, what do you know? We have this component. And what does it do? So it looks like we're passing it data, which this is old code. I would imagine that we can take this out and it wouldn't matter. But that, if you're wondering how you pass data into a component, this is the syntax for it. So it's the colon, the name, and equals the string of the same name. So let's get back in here. So you'll notice that it has the HTML, the template, and it has these computer properties. And instead of using localized from the parent, we're just saying, hey, we're gonna get this data from the store. And so the store kind of does our heavy lifting. Maybe this isn't the best example to start with, but both of them, both code examples are going to be on the slides that I'll post. So I think it would be useful to compare and contrast the differences between the two. And you'll have working examples, which is nice. And yeah, so play around with this. What does this do? I would, if you're getting started, read the documentation. What is a computer property? Why does Vuex use computer properties? What if I have this notion of a prop and this is kind of the syntax for props, and what if I put likes here and I require it as a prop? What is it going to do? I would imagine that it would tell me I'm doing something wrong, but perhaps not. So what does this header thing do? Let's go back to our application, and we'll go into the view portion, and I'll say, okay. So it looks like that was the component we were looking at. Oh, and it looks like it has this notion computer property of a like and a dislike. So go back to the code. Oh, I have two of these things, which is a huge mistake. So we have this here, and it looks like the only thing that it does is it just reads data. So this, in my opinion, this is like the textbook example of what a child component is supposed to do. The only thing it does is it reads in data and it just views it. It's just a view. So we could have this thing subscribe to anything from the store, and it could compute that. Or perhaps we don't want it, so we want to break this thing into two components. We don't like the notion of one component handling two pieces of data. So we're going to have a dislike component and a like component. Well, that's pretty easy to do because this component's not doing anything else except reading this data from the store and presenting it in the view. And ideally, that's the goal, at least in my opinion, when you're kind of building these things. Are there any questions about this? Is this making sense, or should we go back over something? Okay, so I have.
Use the middle of the run.
Oh, of course. So we can see that we're using this interpolation that's, I think, pretty common, and it looks like it's just displaying this computer property. And what does this computer property do? Well, it looks like it just subscribes to the store. It has the state. And so if we go to the store, I bet we'll see this piece of data called dislikes. There was a question earlier about this const self equals this. And that's just something that we do internally for all of our JavaScript methods. And that self equals this is just a reference to the outermost scope of the method. So you're not dealing with, this dot something dot each or whatever, and then you're going into the other one, and then that is also this, and then that is another loop or whatever. It's just more for readability. You don't have to do this, and if it's confusing, I would encourage you to just use this and get rid of this code. Or maybe even play around with it, figure out what self is and kind of what it subscribes to. So let's look at the store, which is here. And we have this notion of the store, and it looks like we instantiate the store with the state of dislikes, and we say we're going to instantiate that to 0. We can kind of look at some of this dislike, the store code. So it looks like there's an action called update dislike count, and it looks like we're passing in the dislikes as well with the context, and that is covered in the documentation. I won't get into that now. And it looks like, so the context has this commit, and we're committing to the store, and we're saying when this update dislike count is called, we want to commit it to this mutation called add to dislike count. And if we come up here, we see the same thing. So this goes back to what I was speaking about earlier, where you dispatch an action from your component to the store. The store sees that, and it says, okay, I know what to do with this. The component shouldn't have to worry about committing to the store. Really, that's in Vuex's kind of design patterns, that's what it cares about. Like, the store should commit to itself. And it kind of exposes these actions to the components, and they can call them as needed. So yeah, so that's kind of our application. Sorry that it's kind of giving an error here. But yeah, that pretty much sums it up. And unless you guys care to look at another piece of code or have any further questions, again, I'm going to post all of this to the Meetup page, and it'll be on GitHub. Feel free to fork it and play around with it. I also have in the presentation, which will be on here, we have, so the Meetup Group started this this thing called Baby Steps, where it's a website, and it's posted on Medium right now, and it's essentially an introduction to the T-Vendor application. So if you've participated in one of the previous 2 Vue.js meetups, I know there's a couple of you here, it's just a step-by-step tutorial, and maybe that will be more beneficial than me just talking, and it'll walk you through how to make that application and kind of go into greater detail about why you're doing what you're doing. We had a question in the back.
So in real life, I would say that it's somewhere that
Yeah, so, well, I would say that the store should never really be, the back end and the front end should be separate concerns. But for example, if you're using, so the question was, how could you convert the store into being kind of the back end? of your application. And in the documentation, there's this notion of a life cycle. So say when you log into your account and this notion of the store is instantiated, it goes through a life cycle, and that's covered in the documentation, but essentially the main part of it is the application upon, I guess, creation, or in the documentation it's called mounted. So you're saying anytime this thing comes into existence, I want to perform this action. So with that, you log into your site, and I would imagine at that point you would have access to an ID that is related to a username and password. So you're saying, hey, I'm the store, I just came into existence, I'm going to take this ID that I got from somewhere, and upon creation, I'm going to call the API again with this ID, and I'm going to get all this information back. So the state is never that of 0. The state will be however many likes that user ended their previous session with. Did that answer your question? Great. Any other questions? Yes.
So let me step it through. You're saying that if it's connected to a REST API, which is backend, user interacts with the app, does the likes, does it immediately go to the REST API or some sort of related action before you commit it to the REST API?
Yeah, I mean, that's your decision, right? So when we go back to the code, so in here, in this mutation, like you're setting the state, right? There's no hard and fast rule that's saying that in this next line you can't call your API and commit that same data, right? So it's really up to you. So say you don't necessarily want this one-for-one communication with your API server. Say you could maybe to extend this, you have something that says a button that says complete or whatever. And then when the user clicks that, it emits this event and something subscribes to it, and then it takes all of that data that it has in the store and then hits your API. So it's kind of up to you how you want to do it. But kind of going back to what we were speaking about earlier, like this notion of the store having all the data, you can imagine something like that is pretty easy to do now, because say you have a REST API component and all it does is talk to the server. But you need to send it data. Well, really, it would look a lot like this, right? Like you would have these computer properties, and then you would probably have, there's a method namespace to where your methods will live in Vue.js. And here it could just say, you do your Ajax call, but you just call, you say, hey, this dot dislikes. This is my, you pass it a parameter or whatever your backend expects the format to be. But you can just, subscribe. You can have all the data it needs, and then in the method you just call that data and then push it up to the front end. Does that make sense?
So you can also change a property of the record. Like for example, this life is just a property of an active record.
Currently, it's not, right? So because we're not getting that state from anywhere. Like we're not getting the number of dislikes from the back end currently, but we could, right? Like we could plug this thing into a back end, and then at that point, you are essentially holding updated records that you have not committed yet. And I guess it depends on how you want to do it. Like, if every time you hit a dislike, you commit that new dislike count to your database, I mean, that's up to you. It kind of depends. But the beauty of this is that you can go through 100 movies or whatever, insert example here, and at the end of that session, the data is all in one spot for you to do what you want. So if at the end of the session, or if every, let's even get a little bit more complicated, every 50th time the like or dislike button has been clicked, you want to commit all that data to the store. Well, that's easy to do, right? Because it's all in one place. And then it's also easy to reset, so you wouldn't have to worry about every 50 having like your back-end logic to figure out what's my last record and then what's the first one, and if those are the same, like do diff logic or whatever. So you're maintaining state on the front end, essentially, and it's up to you what you want to do with that and how you want to do it. Yes, sir.
The example and sort of the explanation that you gave, Vue.js looks like a way to compose a larger canvas from smaller components.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So if that is the case, how do I extend that to more of a multi-page application where I can say, and my question is, does Vue.js in itself, or does it need something else to move from a composing framework to end-to-end web application?
No, I mean you would need a backend, right?
No, not backend, like front-end, my routes and then navigations and so on.
No, so yeah, Vue has a routing library which we use. We use just the jQuery Ajax for Ajax calls, but it has routing. It has libraries to use, so you can get a fully fledged multiple page application with just Vue. You would have to bring in, like a Vue router and such.
Okay.
But I mean, it is a fully fledged application, and it has the ecosystem to, enable you to create whatever you want. Yes.
So the computed properties that you have here, likes and dislikes, you are reading directly from the state, right?
Yes.
So in your app.js file, when you're passing in the likes property to this app header, so is it only for the developer to understand?
Yeah, and I think that was a typo. I apologize for that. I don't think
You mentioned that right.
Yeah. So because we're getting that from the store, we don't need that. My guess is a lot of this was copy and pasted from the other application, which is here, which we can look at an example of. So here, yeah, we're passing in this props, which is image, and if we come, whatever is rendering this movie's, which I'm not totally sure, but you would see that it would be passed in as such through. Here we go. So it looks like this app.view, and then we have where we're passing in the image. So yeah, I apologize for that.
So if we have lots of components which are getting propped directly from the state, then we will not be passing in properties like this, right?
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, and I think that's what I was trying to show, where if you have a lot of data in your application is starting to grow, it becomes very untenable to be passing these properties. So what if this movie component cared about 50 pieces of data? I mean, that's a lot of boilerplate that is going to be your application is going to get pretty bloated. Especially one of the things that I don't like is having these kind of bloated templates. If it requires 50 pieces of data, then you're going to essentially have this line, 50 times. It's going to be pretty difficult to read. And and I think that's the benefit of using Vuex is that that totally goes away, and you're just listening to the store.
So you move these 50 props to the state
Exactly.
for just one comment. So then you just keep on going and going.
Exactly. So you're not worrying about properties coming in. You're just worried about what you're in the computer property you're subscribing. I like to think of it as you're subscribing to these bits of data, and they're there to do what you wish. So the caveat to moving this into a computer property is then your computer property will get big if the component cares about that much data. But either way, I mean, I would rather deal with the computer property being big than having a bunch of pieces of data passing through the HTML.
And
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, at that point, you're probably not testing it. I would imagine a lot of well, I guess, I mean, I'm not an expert in testing JavaScript. So the question was, if you're not using this like NPM, how are you getting these testing libraries? And how would you just test a kind of just like a native JavaScript file, essentially? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if you can. Yeah, sure. And in the documentation, it recommends that you use npm to install Vue.js. So what we did here was kind of just for example purposes. Yes.
I mean, it's easier to use npm, but you would just do what you're already doing, where you just load it in as an asset to a script tag, right?
Yeah. I think yeah. So one of our talks that a community member gave is he's a big back-end guy. He doesn't like the notion of dynamically typed languages really freak him out, but he really likes Vue. Essentially, for what we are doing here is he had a very small piece of data that he needed it to be dynamic. He didn't really want to mess with jQuery, but instead of loading in React, where you have this whole ecosystem, you're dealing with the store, he essentially just required Vue, just regular Vue, not Vuex, and it worked for him. So it's I guess personal preference of what your needs are. I would say that might be another argument for Vue is that there's a difference between Vue and Vuex. It's not all one big thing. Any other questions? Well, thank.
Yeah, one last one. How
Sure.
do you decide what to put in the store? Because at some point you have so much stuff in the store, and the components are so dependent on the store that you can't just reuse them. Okay? Now they're all tied to the store.
Right. So, yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, how do you decide what goes in the store, or when a component is tied to the store, then it's no longer shared, if you will. Like it needs a piece of data now. Like you're tying it to something, and it's the same problem. Like at first it was tied to the parent, now it's tied to the store. And I think I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. There are ways to, and we've kind of explored how to do this, but you have so we have the store here, and this is a parent, but it renders a child. Well, then the parent subscribes to the store, and it passes that data into the child as props. So you can kind of have both going on. But it's up to you and how you want to structure it. And it gives you that flexibility. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for coming out, guys. I appreciate it. And if you have any questions, feel free to email the Meetup Group. Please come to our Meetup Group. It is happening sometime next month. I don't know what the topic will be, but I will post the slides and what I think you guys might be interested in. I have some resources. This top one is really interesting. There's a guy on Quora who's a really good JavaScript developer, and he's a really good writer. He kind of was not speaking ill, but he was expressing some of the things that he didn't like about Vue.js and why React is better. And Ian Yoon, I believe is how you pronounce his name, he was the creator of Vue. He responded in the comment section, and they had a discussion, and it's very, very interesting. So if you're not, if you're like, well, is this worth it? Should I learn React? You might want to give that a read. So this is one that we saw the other day about Vue.js is community driven, so you don't have to worry about a company that like Facebook or Google, directing the direction of the framework. So you can read about that. This is an introduction to Vue, which basically just goes through very tediously how to build that application. And then this is our Meetup Group, so I hope that I will see you guys all there. And please let us know if you have any questions, or you can just email the group questions, or please come to the event or the meetup. You can just subscribe to it on meetup.com, and it should just email me when we're having one. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Michael. And before you guys leave, is there any special topic you guys would like to have present next meetup? Any topic you guys would like to propose? If you don't have any, then we will look at our backlog and then put something from there. Thank you, everyone.